Hello and welcome to Reporters, the show that brings you the best of France 24 reporting from around the globe. Today we're off to the East African state of Burundi. Still recovering from a brutal civil war, Burundi is one of the poorest countries on earth. 90% of people there are dependent on the land, but at the same time the population is growing rapidly. It's set to double within 40 years. On top of that, tens of thousands who fled during the conflict are now coming home. Well, the result is bitter land disputes as neighbours turn against each other and take their claims to the courts. Well, France 24's Jérôme Bonnard has been visiting the country. I'll be speaking to him in just a moment, but first, here's his report in full.
This is the Ngozi court in the north of Burundi. There's a sense of tension in the air, and there's little patience to be had. It's the same story every week. Real estate files constantly stack up on the judge's desk. Inheritance issues, disputes between neighbours, breakups and sales of land. Thousands of cases like these often sour relations between locals. This man says he has a problem with his cousin.
He's harvesting on our land, even though my father is still alive, with me and my brothers. The elders have already settled this matter in the village, and I won.
However, the cousin claims he has history on his side, and that this had been dealt with 40 years ago.
He has no right to this land. If he did, we'd see his name on the papers. My grandfather always told me that it was his and that I couldn't let anyone else have it.
Often this court is the last resort for the desperate. Trials are complicated and can drag on. In the Burundian countryside, it's often a case of one person's word against another's.
Most of the cases we deal with here aren't about registered property, so we have to resort to evidence from witnesses.
It's a roundabout process, and barely one case in 5 is eventually settled. After 5 years in court, Apollinaire hopes he'll be lucky. But his village isn't nearby, and he couldn't make it for the verdict. So the bailiff came to inform him of the final decision, and it's not good news.
Listen, we've heard your case, Mr. Apollinaire, but the arguments you made haven't been convincing. The property at the centre of the dispute will be shared between both parties. Do you understand? The land which has caused conflict will be shared between you and the descendants of the plaintiff.
For Apollinaire, it's a bitter pill to swallow.
They want us to share the land of our grandfather.
And you don't want to?
Of course not.
To get to the bottom of things, we went back to Apollinaire's home, about 30 kilometers away from the court. Deeply in debt due to the trial, there's little chance of any appeal. This small field is the heart of the matter. Apollinaire's grandfather would have acquired it under the royal regime back in 1952.
I grow beans, manioc. Look, there are also coffee beans and avocados over there.
It's not hard to create tension in a poor country where many are happy just to survive off the bare minimum. That despite Burundi's rich land. Apollinaire has a huge extended family. Some have dug in on a hill on the property, putting pressure on him to share some of his inherited land. His cousin Melchior had the same grandfather, the only thing the two have in common. When they decide to talk to each other, it's a discussion for the whole family. But it's still difficult to find out where the truth lies.
If your grandfather just once grew sweet potatoes on this land, then say so.
He's lying.
Are you daring to call me a liar?
Why am I saying that? Because you know the king expropriated this land to give it away? Who did he chase off? This land was bought by my grandfather for a sheep and 3 pickaxes.
Legal proceedings may be over, but it seems the family will remain divided for some time to come. In Burundi, land is handed down from generation to generation, and according to common law, The elders are the final arbiters. With property disputes on the rise, the state has been struggling to decentralize land registry services. This commune near Ngozi has seen its first real estate office. It's a revelation for locals who want to find a sense of security about their land.
They come in huge numbers because they're afraid that their allotments will be monopolized following the crisis that threatened our town.
Small plots of land are ever more coveted and carved up. The country is fast running out of space, but there are ever more mouths to feed. The population looks to double within the next 30 years. Authorities are looking for alternatives. Cultivating swamps is one such possibility. Many households are now using such terrain to grow rice, when before it would have been left vacant. It's a way of surviving and getting away from property hassles, a subject many would prefer to forget.
No, they're afraid to talk about it. There's a bad connotation in saying that there have been disputes. They won't tell you directly, but even so, most have seen situations of such land disputes.
Here things are different. Disputes are a thing of the past. Men and women, brothers, sisters, cousins and neighbours have all left their villages to go into the fields to work the land together. Something almost never seen in Burundi. There are several hundred of them, and they can produce up to 5 tons of rice per hectare.
It's an alternative we're currently setting up. It helps households that have small parcels of marsh to take advantage of them and establish good water management elsewhere. Then they'll be able to produce crops for each of the 3 seasons of the year.
The aim is simply to have enough to eat, and if things go well, maybe even earn a little money from selling the surplus harvest. But even this has its limits.
Given that land isn't elastic, at some point, if things continue like this, with such population growth, we'll eventually get stuck. What's necessary are ways of limiting births, and that, it's all political.
Moreover, Burundi has another problem: the return of refugees, more than 500,000 of them across the whole country. This is Rumonge in Burundi's south, a town badly hit during 2 ethnic conflicts. Thousands died and even more fled into exile. Today, former refugees are coming home and they want back the land occupied by their neighbours or that was brought by others. A lot of them appeal to the National Commission of Land and Property, which handles disputes. With mediation, most cases can end with a negotiated agreement between the former occupant and the person who took over.
Today, understanding is becoming more solid, and it's about sharing when the National Commission insists.
Still, some 10% of negotiations fail, and that's when the state steps in.
The Commission has to work with the administration, which is looking for empty areas in which to relocate the repatriated who have lost their land.
The luckiest are those who end up in what are known as integrated villages around Rumonge. 568 families received a small hut with a garden and a few animals thanks to UN support. Safira is a widow and a mother of 6. An exile in Tanzania, she hadn't returned to her country for 30 years. Today, she has to work for others.
I labour. I work in the farmer's fields. They give me a little money. With that, I try to get by with my children every day.
Despite her willingness to work, it's not enough. She's still waiting for the half-hectare plot that she was promised.
When I finally have this land, I'll be able to grow my own crops, plant new seeds, sell a little, and keep the rest to feed my family.
Still, this village has been here for 2 years, and it seems the distribution of land is badly delayed.
Food-producing blocks belong to the state. And when the state wanted to take back these areas, to hand them over to people set up in rural villages, of course, there was resistance from those who worked the land before.
These are the blocks in question, and so-called Burundian gold. Palm trees as far as the eye can see. Producing all sorts of things from oil to soap, they're a source of national pride. Initially, the land was vacated by people fleeing from massacres in 1972. The administration at the time then gave it to farmers. They worked the land and became rich, and now they don't want to share the fruit of their labor, even if the state wants to give some of that land back. Some areas are meant to have been redistributed already, but it seems the postman forgot to pass by. You said you didn't know, but this is an official decree from the Ministry of Agriculture.
That's the first time I've personally seen this.
Whether he's seen it or not, the paper orders the restitution of 1,000 hectares for returning refugees. And the farmers aren't going to give in without a fight.
We are proud that our repatriated brothers and sisters are being resettled in good conditions, that they get land. However, we need to think about it. Otherwise, it'll create hatred among compatriots.
The order would affect up to 1,000 farmers. It's a matter of considerable economic upheaval that could threaten many jobs, and even the workers aren't happy.
They didn't even consult us. They've done nothing for us. How am I going to feed my children?
Burundi is slowly recovering from a history of political turmoil, but this matter could well prove to be a stumbling block to a process of national reconciliation. Land reform is already underway, but time is short. Like many nations in Africa, people are fleeing the countryside, heading for the towns and cities. And capital Bujumbura seems to see ever more bicycle taxis on its streets every day, as youths with little future in the countryside search for opportunities elsewhere.
Well, Jérôme Bonnard, the journalist behind that report, joins me now in the studio. Thanks for being with us today, Jérôme. Now, as we saw in that report, in Burundi, there's simply not enough land for everyone to live on. It seems a pretty hopeless situation. Can that be blamed on the government?
Well, you know, today in Burundi, the political leaders are completely overwhelmed, you know. Over the past 40 years, they've been focusing on civil wars, you know, ethnic tensions, peace process, and war again, and they put all the other questions, the other issues in the shadow. And today there is a massive population growth because there's a relatively better political situations and people feel safer to make babies, but there's the problem of lands. And this is a real vicious circle.
Now, we saw in your report as well, of course, people taking their claims to court, people getting pretty angry about those land disputes, understandably. Are these disputes preventing the country from moving forward after a very bitter civil war?
Well, as I said, there's a progress in peace process. You know, there have been elections, political elections last summer in relatively good conditions, but today the situation is still fragile. You know, the best example we saw in the report is the palm industry in the south. You know, you have those rich farmers who got the lands like 30, 40 years ago from the previous authorities, and today all the refugees are back to claim those lands, so it can be a risk of increasing again the ethnic tensions.
And are we seeing those disputes turn into violence sometimes?
Yeah, to violence, well, it's hard to say whether the quest for lands will lead the country to a genocide or a new civil war, you know, but it's a very sensitive question. And I think that the situation in the short and long term will really depend on what kind of solutions the governments will put forward.
And what kind of solutions are being talked about in Burundi now?
Well, in Burundi now there's a new law of property which should be voted very soon. Hopefully, there are a lot of expectations on that law, a law which could help to fight the population growth and also bring new services to decentralize the property offices. Because today the big problem is that the farmers in the campaigns in the countryside, they are not able to register their lands. So that's why we have a problem in the tribunals, because they don't have evidence to prove that that they actually own the land, and this can create conflicts.
All right, Jérôme Bonnaud, many thanks indeed for bringing us your report and for talking to us today. Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Reporters. Many thanks indeed for watching. Do stay tuned to France 24, more news and headlines coming up, and I'll be back at the same time next week.